Now I can continue with our presentation of our invited speakers. Thomas Steenberg obtained his PhD at the University of Vienna in the year 1997. And during his career, he worked as a postdoc researcher at C0. That stands for Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. I Googled it. At the Division of Wildlife Ecology in Perth, Australia. Plus, he was a visiting scientist at the biology department in Boston, the US. And since 2002, he's employed at the Environmental Agency in Austria with a focus on long-term ecosystem monitoring and research, including the development of the European eLTER research infrastructure through several EU-funded projects. There, he studies the effects of air pollution, climate and land use change on ecosystems using empirical data, biostatistics, and modeling, and he supports the policy development. Thomas is also responsible for the national critical load work in the framework of ICP modeling and mapping within the UN Air Pollution Convention and is the national focal point for the implementation of ecosystem monitoring under the EU NEC, which stands for the National Emissions Reduction Commitments Directive. Welcome, Thomas. And Ingolf obtained his PhD in 2000 at the University of Bochum, where he worked on flora and vegetation, comparing ancient and recent forests. He then moved to the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, where he is currently head of the department Community Ecology and the deputy lead of the research unit Ecosystems of the Future. He specialized in biological invasions as well as impacts of land use change and climate change on plant species occurrences and functional changes of plant communities. For more than 10 years, he's associated with the LTER Europe and the preparation of eLTER. Welcome, Ingolf, also. And okay, I think that was it from my part. I think we can get started with Thomas's presentation. If you're ready.
Yeah, I'm trying to share it again. So this should work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good. So thanks a lot for the invitation, Teresa, and I'm happy to try to give some insights into what we mean by WAILS. It's eLTER's concept, scientific concept, let's say, and the whole title is Whole System Approach for In-Situ Research on Life Supporting Systems. So that's the whole title for WAILS, and let me start right away with okay. All right, this one. So this is our photo exhibition. I hope many of you have been there in Sofia, Bulgaria, where in spring all these nice pictures were presented. The exhibition was opened, and many of you have been there. And this is prominent path crossing important areas in Sofia. So many people are walking by and they see what we are doing. So a lot of nice pictures of people working somewhere on towers and nice landscapes, used landscapes, and very different things. And above is our vision. So which states that the eLTER research infrastructure will respond to the challenges of understanding the complex interactions between people and nature over the long term. So I think everybody agrees that this is quite high fly. So it's pretty high fly vision and a bit abstract. And in order to bring this down to Earth, we need a kind of a common understanding about the science we aim at with our infrastructure. And one tool to achieve this is through scientific theory, and which is then the basis for designing sites, platforms, our entire network, and also the services we provide to the users of the infrastructure. So, and this is kind of the aim is why my presentation, give you a general insight into one of the tools, and this is, of course, the WAILS concept. So, but this is not acting in a vacuum. So our infrastructure is built within a lot of framework conditions. One of these is the European Research Area. And because this is where we are embedded and where we, most of the cases, also get our funding from. So, and also strategic wise, we need to work a lot into these, into the framing of the research area to also in future get funding and that we can follow our vision, let's say. So in this framework condition of the era is I mean, you all are familiar with the left part here, the Horizon Europe programs where many of you apply funding. This is where the excellent science is and the societal challenges also. I will talk about that later. But there's also these partnerships and missions programs. So this is kind of the framing and streamlining of cooperation. And then there is this big pillar of the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructure, which is the ESFRI. This is where all the research infrastructures are. And you see there's a lot of interaction. So the missions and partnerships, they work towards the infrastructures, and the Horizon Europe program works towards and is using the research infrastructures. And also the national research programs, they align their research towards this framework. So this is one framework condition we have to deal with when implementing the RI. And the other one is the research infrastructure landscape. So we are not alone. There are many more research infrastructures out there, also competing with us, of course, but also cooperating a lot with us. And starting with the user community, there are a couple of e-infrastructures which don't really have sites on the ground. So they develop services. Let's say LifeWatch is one important one for us because they develop services towards biodiversity research. And then there are these in-situ research research infrastructures. Partly they have to focus on observation, which is ACTRIS, aerosol and clouds, ICOS, greenhouse gas measurements. And then we have an experimental focused research infrastructures as well, like ANAE, which is mostly on terrestrial ecosystem experiments, and Aquacosm, which is more focused on aquatic experiments. And eLTER is kind of a system we are developing. We should be complementary to all of these four main research infrastructures. It should be interoperable, and there should be co-location. So we try to, as much as we can, co-locate systems on the ground in a specific place. Apart from that, there's also, of course, some infrastructure which don't often think about, but they also developed big data infrastructures like EUDAT or computer capacity like EOIC and DISCO, like reference data and so on and so on. So this is the whole landscape, and we have to find our way through that somehow with our what we are doing, how we design our facilities, and also how we implement our research there. So eLTER has to focus. So using the research challenges and the related policies is one way to focus. So eLTER dedicates itself to focus on biodiversity loss and land use change. And I don't read the policies there. I mean, you can read it if you like. So there are many policies related, of course, to this research. Challenges. There's climate change, of course, the big climate crisis on planet B. There is nitrogen as one of the main eutrophying pollutants we have on the earth. So this is a huge issue as well. And there are a couple of policies related to that, and sustainable management of ecosystems, water, soil, and biodiversity. This is where we deal with like the human systems or the interactions, nature and humans, how they interact, and how can we support a transformation towards more sustainability with our research we do. So using that, eLTER in the last couple of years has been streamlined towards some main characteristics, I would say, and they are all familiar to us. I just want to plot them to have some kind of basis where you see, okay, this fits to what I'm coming up later with the WAILS concept. So the first one is we are site-based. So we use sites and platforms and their measurements across all spheres. So this is the holistic approach, so whole system approach, first part of WAILS. So we use, we work within the interactions between atmosphere, sociosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere. And we want to do that in a representative way across Europe. With these are the number of sites which are now seem to be implemented in the near future, 200 eLTER sites and kind of 45 LTSER platforms. So this is the first pillar, I would say, main characteristic. The second one is we want to achieve fair, accessible data, observation data. So eLTER has a strong observation focus, let's say. And these data, the data we are generating and we want to generate is based on a lack of data. So I mean, everybody's aware that we just don't have the data we need for this kind of holistic approaches. So we need highly standardized data. This is the standard observations. They have been developed and the protocols are now in development as well. But we're also dealing with legacy data. So this is the data many of the sites already did measure for many, many years, some even decades. And there is third-party data like remote sensing products and other statistical data or data from monitoring, which is done at the sites as well. So there's a lot of data, and we want to create these information clusters where people, researchers, also other users can have access to this kind of site-based data. But this is not all, actually. It's not only about data, and there is also creating knowledge hubs, let's say. So the knowledge hubs, what I want to express, there is at the sites, there is a critical mass of scientists working together, creating a lot of knowledge, doing hardcore science, scientific cooperation across sites. They try to co-locate, so they do experiments, observation from different research initiatives, even infrastructures at one site. Sites are opened, so scientists can go there, visit, and do their research there. And also the data should be open. So also all the research infrastructure, they have a strong focus on opening the data. So this is kind of an archetypical site, just to speak reality here. I use my example, actually. I'm working there for like 20 years already. So this is in the heart of Austria, in the Limestone Alps, a national park. So there is a catchment area here, delineated 90 hectares. And what we do there is we measure as good as we can all inputs, energy, matter, water, all the outputs, energy, matter, water, and also what's going on within the ecosystems with regard to biota, biodiversity, soil, and the habitats. So it's a very holistic kind of approach, and this is some kind of an archetypical site which should then be used in the entire network. But we go beyond that, actually. So there are also these platforms where the society comes in, interaction between nature and society. This is the LTSR platform Eisenwurzel, which we work in. So our site is also in this platform. But there are another 11 LTR sites, actually, additionally to our ones in different habitats they're implemented within the platforms. And there is a very strong interaction, of course, with stakeholders, regional development, leader associations, tourism associations, representatives of policy, municipalities, and so on. So this is it's a very strong focus on the people living there and the institutions which are working in these areas. So what's the theory behind that? So we have developed that. Everybody takes this as granted. So this is how site-based work looks like, or platform work looks like. So what's the basis for that, actually? So we are always using this graph here. So there is a horizontal and a vertical layer to the WAILS concept, to the scientific WAILS concept. And the horizontal level is where the sites and platforms are based. So this is, we use the pulse press dynamic concept, which Collins published in 2011. I will go into detail for that, but this is kind of the site level. But we don't just work on the sites, on the platforms. We also want to kind of get derive information, knowledge, research, which can be upscaled to Europe as good as we can. So the scientific concept used there is the macrosystem ecology concept from Heffernan, published in 2014. We'll also go into detail a bit with regard to that. So these are the two scientific strains we embed our entire research infrastructure on. So the first one is press pulse dynamic model from Collins, and I just quote him here because I can't actually say it better than they frame it in their paper. So it's an iterative framework that integrates the biophysical and social science through an understanding, and this is important here, how human behavior affects press and pulse dynamic and ecosystem processes. So there is a lot of dynamics processes in turn, and they influence the ecosystem services, and they thereby then alter the human behavior again and initiate feedbacks. The nice thing about this model is that there are specific locations where the research hypotheses are located actually in the system, and this is what we actually do all the time. So whenever we apply for a research project, we are somewhere in this graph, in these hypothesis parts of the graph here. Even if we do ecological science or social ecological science, we're always somewhere in these 1 to 6 hypothesis areas and work on processes and find something out in this complex system here. So the next one is the macrosystems ecology from Heffernan. It's the ecology of regions and continents, and it tries to bridge the gap between detailed analysis at the local levels and to kind of have a common understanding on how we can upscale that, or what's going on in the upscaling. So they speak of there is the left graph shows you the kind of the nomenclature, and the right one is a concrete example here of how they frame macrosystem ecology. And on the upper level, we have these daily connections. It's kind of a strange word for me always, but it means that, for example, the global economic drivers, which are happening across the globe, even across very far distances, but there's always also, for example, the El Niño phenomenon is a teleconnection process in their nomenclature. So very large-scale global patterns which act across the globe, actually. Cross-scale interaction is how demand for grazing areas affect forest clearing in the local scale. So this is a cross-scale interaction where at the higher scale something is happening which affects the local scale here. This is often non-linear, and there are a lot of thresholds involved very often. The macro-scale feedback is then, in the concrete example, how vegetation changes affect climate. So through albedo, for example, or evaporative cooling, or whatever you want to have here. The cross-scale emergence is then when many local changes, for example, in land use, result in continental scale, let's bring it that way, vegetation patterns, new patterns, which emerge at another scale. So these are kind of the framing they use for this macrosystems ecology thing here, and I think Ingolf will, with his part, dive in a bit there. So from theory to praxis, what's our take here? How do we actually do science within the framework of WAILS? And I guess many of you are doing it actually without knowing. And I think it's cool if eLTER makes this explicit. So whenever we as a community do science or do research, that we are aware, okay, I'm kind of working in the concept of eLTER, and this is kind of a WAILS, even if I am on just working on some of the screws here and there, but I'm part of that, of the big picture. So this is what also example from my own publications, but many of you are doing that actually. It's site-based work, so putting a lot of knowledge together at the sites. So, and as soon as you cross, I would say, as soon as you cross disciplinary domains, with your results, you're already part of WAILS here. So this is an example where we work on nitrogen fluxes, where we to interpret the results we have, we need many different data sets and knowledge, actually. So we have to know what's coming in from the air, how the vegetation changed, how the soil changed. There's a lot of soil science involved, and then the runoff, the hydrology behind that, and the hydrochemistry behind that. So this is classical catchment science, I would say. Classical catchment science is already kind of a WAILS approach. So synthesizing a lot of disciplinary knowledge to come up with a broader picture on what's going on in the site and how does this fit into others' results and so on. So we can do place-based research, of course, is also done on the platform level. So this is where we work on human-nature interaction. So how does the decision-making of human beings act on ecosystems, and how is this influenced? So this is an example from a group in Austria as well, where they use agent-based models which implement decision-making towards their land use changes. So how is this affecting land use changes? And there's of course a framework condition. Climate change is affecting that, but also the political framework, how the gap is framed, and so on, for example. But the interesting thing is here that we can then link these land use models, which are driven by decisions from land users, into ecological results as well, and then feed that back. So this is one example here where they then looked into the biodiversity effects of the land use change compared to climate change here in the Eisenwurzen region. So using these agent results from the agent-based models. So this is really showing how interactive this kind of research between natural science and social science can be. I don't want to go into detail here. I think there's not time for doing that. Just as an example here. So when we go to the macro scale, then the simplest approach is, I would say, comparing sites results. So this is again an example from the air pollution work we did. It's about retention of nitrogen in catchments and on a time trend, and the arrow bars, they show you just the variance within the site network. So we'll taking all sites together. So we put that together to some fancy statistics on then, and then you can derive the continental scale trends when they are there, or if they're not there, you don't find them. That's a pretty simple approach, I would say. Putting a lot of data from trend data from sites together. And this can go into very fancy analysis on a lot of data, like the big data analysis Peter Hase has done on, recently published with In-Situ Plus project, or as well on freshwater biodiversity, how this changed. And this is a huge data set. I mentioned just this number of sites from different countries, how this data was put together and then analyzed on a very long time trend across the entire European domain. So quite impressive. So this is also, of course, classical WAILS macrosystems ecology analysis. And the last one is modeling. So models put together Earth system science models, for example, like we used here in the eLTER Plus science project. The Jülich-Zentrum did that here, where they put together eLTER site data, satellite data, put it into an Earth system science model like CLM5 here. And the models themselves, they try to integrate. So models are tools to integrate a lot of knowledge, especially a system science model where you have all the relevant processes of the ecosystems involved there, and you come up with results. This is just an example on water use efficiency. So calculating water use efficiency changes across Europe, comparing that with the station data and with remote sensing data and the model data. So this is the kind of macrosystems ecology work we are doing with models. So it's also like the modeling, the big data, and the cross comparison of sites. So these are three very classical approaches in macrosystems ecology. So this is my last slide already. So how far did we get actually? So I was thinking a bit. So what we always had this theoretical WAILS concept behind, and how far did we get there? So I think there are a lot of good achievements actually. So one is the eLTER site and platform design is consolidated. So we have a written text on how these sites should look like. And we have criteria and hard criteria and soft criteria and so on, but we know how this should look like. So this is good. I think we have the standard observation. I think that was a key achievement. So we know what we want to measure. So how do we take the main information from a whole system into measurements? So this was a big achievement, and the protocols are now in progress. Teresa and team is working on that very hard. And I'm really looking forward to that, so that also it will be clearer for those running the sites to know what exactly they have to do in the sites with regard to measuring the standard observations. Also, the network is much clearer now. We've done a pre-labeling, so everybody is aware which sites will be where, very likely actually. And we have also identified the gaps, so we know pretty good where we need additional sites and where the sites are already so abundant and we don't really have to put work into finding additional sites or convincing shareholders to pay more sites, whatever. Also, eLTER data services are in development. There are a lot of pilots in the pipeline and good examples. And I mean, this will be anyway a focus on in the future. And we had this very nice early career WAILS workshop last year in Gran Paradiso, Italy, eLTER site, where we were a bunch of people, I don't remember, 20, 25, 30 or so, working on WAILS for a week, actually, with a concrete example in this park area there with all the eLTER people. They're giving us their knowledge and trying to do what WAILS, what in the heart of WAILS is. So a lot of insights from very different disciplines and coming up with a nice workshop on that. And that was a good experience as well. So I'm looking forward to do that again coming years. And with that, I'm giving back to Teresa, I guess.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Thomas. That was very good. Yeah, I think I'm gonna hand over directly to Ingolf, and then I think we can take hope we have some time for questions after both presentations, and then I think we can take the questions after Ingolf's presentation.
And in the meantime, you can also write them in the chat so we can come back to them so we don't forget.
All right, thank you very much. The presentation I'm giving is, of course, the biodiversity perspective of WAILS. However, biodiversity is so big and so complex, we have to focus a little bit on that. And you know, biodiversity, people in eLTER are probably always the troublemakers, but one of the reasons is that the great physicist Feynman once said, consider electrons had emotions, how much harder would physics be? You know, and now elements of biodiversity do not only have emotions, but they interact in not always foreseeable ways with each other. So that makes it complex. So I'm going to focus, especially after some very general introduction, on European mountain ecosystems. First of all, because they're probably a little bit simpler than others, they are more prone to climate change, and they were also the topic of the WAILS Early Career workshop in Gran Paradiso that Thomas just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Now, you know that already. So this is just a very, very brief introduction. However, I would like to add one thing to the scaling issue, the downscaling and upscaling. So it is not only that we can scale across sites and from the sites to the site network across Europe, for example, but we can also scale within the platforms and within the sites because they're nested. Within a platform, we have several sites, and also within a site, we probably have, for example, several plots in forests, several plots in grasslands, which means that we can also scale within platforms and sites to different aspects. For us, the macro-scale ecological framework is extremely important because it combines the different processes with the patterns that we see across scales. It combines biodiversity, so biotic elements, with the abiotic factors, and probably would also enable to provide a proper link between energy fluxes, matter fluxes, and biodiversity, which so far is missing. However, one of the really big advantages of macro-scale ecology is that we have within-scale feedbacks among the different drivers. So we know, for example, that there is a feedback between climate change and land cover. You cannot, or land management, depending on the severity of droughts, for example. You have to water, you have to irrigate your fields. Depending on the climate, you cannot cultivate all crops, but they depend on the climate that is there. So there is a cross-scale there is a within-scale feedback, but there is also that within-scale feedback of abiotic factors to biodiversity and biodiversity with each other. For example, predator-prey relationships, or pathogens, or mutualist relationships, competition, and whatever is there. And then we have the cross-scale interactions where, for example, large-scale effects like climate can have really small-scale effects on biodiversity. And there we also have, let's say, microclimatic conditions which can be buffered by biodiversity. So it's not only that climate has an effect on biodiversity, but biodiversity, let's take a forest, can have micro-scale impacts on local climatic conditions. And then we have the cross-scale interactions with specific feedback loops, so that one scale can feed back onto the other scale. For example, if there is enough micro-scale climatic buffering, there might be a feedback up to higher scales, which might be promoted and moderated by vegetation and by the type of vegetation that we have. Just take the different albedo, for example, of a grassland and of a forest. Now, once we're beyond that theoretical framework, we would need to think, how can we do successful analyses of biodiversity? And this is probably not only a very short summary of how to do successful biodiversity research, but probably more general. However, what makes an observational fieldwork really successful, and this is, first of all, you need to have a good research question, or you need to have a sound hypothesis. Otherwise, you're, especially in the era of big data, you're just fishing for patterns. And with the tons of data that we have out there, we might get dozens of patterns that seem to be very sensible, but they aren't sensible. So they might simply be statistical artifacts or whatever is there. Similarly, we can have just spurious relationships between drivers and responses that we might find there. And if they are not based on hypotheses, based on theory, we might simply go astray. That doesn't mean that there isn't a way for serendipity, but this is something that usually emerges as you see it. This is usually not something that you get out of the data by doing big, large data mining analyses. And also all the serendipity that comes, for example, from astrophysics is something that is expected by theory, but then there are big infrastructures to trying to catch these patterns that are there because they have their hypotheses and questions. But to answer them, you need a proper sampling design that really allows to answer your questions, and the standardized field protocols are one baseline for it. So this is really why, whenever possible, we aim at having standard observations that really follow standards that are more strict. Although I know that to account for the legacy data, sometimes we're less strict. but at least they need to allow for comparability, because if they are less comparable, you might get artifacts simply because the one pattern here and the one pattern there are based on different protocols. I come back to that towards the end of my talk. Then, of course, you need to do efficient field work. You need to rely on the field work. This is the background of many of us. As important is efficient research data management. If your data is stored in an Excel file, this is not efficient, and your data needs to be interoperable, and only this interoperability can be done by research data management. And there we come also to different aspects of fair data, and so I come back to that later on. We do need sound statistics. For some questions, a t-test is fully sufficient. For some questions, you might need much more elaborate statistics, especially if you do time series analyses or cross-space analyses, where we do have dependencies among the different samples, because let's say the population size of a bird population this year strongly depends on how large the population was last year. Or the floristic composition in the city of Halle, where I live, is probably more similar to the floristic composition of the city of Leipzig, which is adjacent, than to Helsinki or Rome or Sofia. Then, once the results are there, you really need to interpret them very thoughtfully. Does it ecologically make sense or not? If it doesn't make sense, it might be true, but you might consider, is there an artifact? If they seem to be sound, they can be sound, but maybe for the wrong reasons. So really, even if you like the pattern, critically revisit whether this is a genuine pattern. And then at the end, you need excellent communication skills to communicate your results and conclusions to your stakeholders. And while here, all of this usually is required by one person, there are disciplines which share it among different persons. For example, physics, again, they do the basic science. The transfer into society is being done by engineers, a completely different discipline. All right, and a permanent reminder, especially when you do the analysis of the biodiversity, of the large biodiversity data that will come out of eLTER, is to think before what you're going to do, which analysis you're going to use, because to call a statistician after the experiment or the observation or the analysis is done may be no more than asking him or them to perform a post-mortem examination. They may be able to say what the experiment died of. So, and the same is true for any type of observational data. Now, we rely on long-term observational data here. However, there is a wide variety. So what is the purpose of that observations? What are the questions? And of course, eLTER wants to serve a wide variety of different purposes and questions, which is okay. The data is being provided, which is okay. However, once you start using it, you need to know, why do you want that data and for what reason do you want that data? If you don't have proper questions, if you don't have a proper idea, you cannot get a good answer. So before you apply for the data, you need to think, what are your hypotheses and questions? What is the data that you need? You do not need all data, because if you got all data in, you get something out, and both of them might be rubbish. How do you get that data? And then design the observational study or the statistics that you use accordingly. And usually we can distinguish our observational studies according to the degree of observations. So either intervention occurs naturally or is not planned, or intervention is planned. And this goes to the experimental side. So intervention is randomly assigned. We do have several treatments, and the treatments are, in some random block design or whatever, some sort of design. That's the true experiment. This is usually not the domain of eLTER. intervention is exogenous, which means, for example, forestry department plans to have some coniferous forestry here and some hardwood forestry there, some clear cuts at another place. You cannot plan them, but you can take advantage of them and have comparable or comparative approaches. These are strong quasi-experiments. Now we come to the natural or unplanned interventions. An intervention is exogenous, so like a storm, like a fire, like a drought. And that can be considered as a natural experiment. Or the intervention uses ecological contrasts that are endogenous. And I'm sorry, then we arrive at observational studies. And this is largely, the last two bits are largely the domain of eLTER. We can also distinguish by the intention that we have. So there is opportunistic data acquisition. I don't go into detail. And then there is design data acquisition. And I guess you all agree we are there. There are short-term observations we do not need to care for, but there are long-term observations, but no monitoring. And monitoring is considered here in a broader sense. Monitoring is not only if it is required by law, if there is a legal requirement, but it's really the repeated observation, like we do in eLTER. So there are repeated observations for many years, not necessarily with a legal observation. And again, this can be question-driven. What is the impact of climate change on butterfly or bird populations? They can be legally required, like the Habitats Directive monitoring that goes on throughout the European Union. And there's passive monitoring, no hypothesis, no management. And this is where we usually work with, which makes it even more important that before we acquire the data for our biodiversity research, we think about what do we want to answer, because the monitoring as such doesn't care what our questions are. And there we need to think about, for example, what are the different extents of the data that is there? Which network do we want to have pan-European data or just within a biogeographic region? What is the resolution? Is the resolution the plot, the site, the platform? Are they blocked? If they are blocked, what are in the blocks? Are they nested? And again, this is something that needs to match the question that you have, and you need to identify the appropriate scale for the dynamics that you want to analyze, and also the appropriate resolution for the homogeneity that you need or the heterogeneity that you want in the data. Now, as I said, just considering all biodiversity is probably a bit complex, so I just want to focus on 3 or 4 biodiversity trends and drivers in the Alps. So getting data from summits all over Europe and also beyond, and revisits of the summits of Europe after 30, 40, 50, 100, 150 years, we found out that, of course, we know that due to climate change, there is an increase in species richness at the summits. But what was really astonishing, that especially during the last 20 or 30 years, the increase in species richness is increasing because climate change and temperatures are also not only increasing, but the slope is upwards. So now the slope is much steeper than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Thomas was involved in a work where they modeled the proportional loss of different habitat types across Austria. And that was specifically in the Alps, where they looked what is the current species richness and what is the loss of species richness according to different climate change scenarios. And they found out, especially in the alpine regions, there is a severe risk for habitats of losing the species. And the upward range shifts of plants usually average per decade in altitude roughly 6 meters. However, climate change is even faster, which means that the population dynamics may lag behind the climatic changes, because currently we consider that there's roughly 10 meters per decade according to altitude. So there's at least 4 meters lagging per decade of the species to come upward. Now, each of those species, though, responds differently. And it's not the species that responds, it's the different individuals that move upwards. And the different individuals have different speeds, and the different species have different individuals of different speeds. So a classical picture says, according to climate change, there is different vegetation zones, and these vegetation zones move upwards. However, we had a look a couple of years ago in a study where we looked whether species co-occurring currently in mountain and alpine ecosystems, and those are the one in red, would co-occur in the future. And you see, if they would be around the zero line, they still would co-occur. If they were below the zero line, they wouldn't co-occur, and there is less species co-occurring together in the future, which means the community composition of species in the future will be different to those of species that we currently have, because it's not communities or habitats that move upwards, but it's the individuals that disperse there. And therefore, in the future, we have a change in community composition, and the community may look completely different. This might also be driven by microclimatic conditions, and there's a very nice work from Shah and Kerner who showed that between a southerly exposed and a northerly exposed slope, there is a large difference in microsite temperatures during daytimes. It is different during night times. They argue that under climate change, these microclimatic refuges might allow the species to find at a very closely, not very far away place, a refuge under climate change. However, there again, we're now at macrosystems ecology. There is a strong interdependence of microclimate and macroclimate. And if you look at the snow line down there, you know, if it snows during nighttime, you don't see any microclimatic differences. The line between snow and no snow is almost sharp, independent of the exposition and the inclination there. And currently, it is really unknown, it is complex how these micro, meso, and macro scale climate impacts on biotic elements really work together. And there's an ERC project that Stefan Dullinger works on, who tries to unravel this whole thing at the University of Vienna. Nevertheless, long-term and cross-scale studies are needed for that. Now, in the Alps, we do have several trends, and they have different impacts on biodiversity. So climate change temperature is going to increase, effect on biodiversity is negative. We are going to have more biological invasions, more non-native species. The effect of native biodiversity is negative. Land use management, we have intensification or not. So, of course, in the lowlands, we have intensification. In the highlands, in the higher Alps, it's a mixed thing. So sometimes there's land abandonment, sometimes there's intensification, sometimes there's extensification, but many of them, either land abandonment has a negative impact on biodiversity, land use intensification has a negative impact on biodiversity. There's an increase in forested area, and currently it's not really known whether this is positive or negative. It really depends on the taxonomic group you're looking at. So it's really complex. Thomas mentioned the study of Pilotto in Peter Haase's group, where we assembled a large set of long-term data, and focusing at the Alps, we see that there is a quite complex pattern, and I do not want to go into detail with that, but on average, we see that there is a positive effect in turnover in the alpine areas as well as in large parts of terrestrial northeastern Europe. Some of the ideas that we wanted to do to analyze that spatial turnover, that turnover is to use a spatial turnover index to measure the temporal changes in spatial dissimilarity following an approach by Tatsumi et al. Published a few years ago. And we want to study the temporal beta diversity and compare not the spatial turnover over time, but really at a site how over time the different communities change. For this, we have worked out quite a complex workflow for our biodiversity science case. And it involves lots of steps and lots of things where we need to change anything. I do not want to go into detail. However, we forgot one major issue right at the beginning. That was to look at the metadata information that was available. And after 3 years of working with the data, we got some funny patterns. And then we went back to the original data, went back to the metadata information and realized that for a given site, for a given time series, the spatial resolution changed not only across years, but also across seasons within years, which means we cannot disentangle whether our turnover pattern really resulted from environmental changes or simply from undocumented changes in the methodology according to which that was changed. And the metadata simply said plot size varies from 10 square meters to 1,000 square meters within years and across years. And of course, this is metadata information, but this is nonsensical metadata information. Therefore, only sufficiently clear meta information will allow us to do thorough analyses. And they need to be specific per campaign, per sampling event, not per site or per time series, because that might change. And we need to know what is the spatial resolution, which taxonomic backbone would be used, is there a nesting structure, a hierarchical design, and other things. So for your data to become useful, you need to invest some time and some effort into proper metadata annotation. Otherwise, one might realize that after a couple of years of work, the work was useless and that your data might become useless. It might not be sensible for specific things. To finish, long-term observations are crucial. I hope with the case studies from the Alps, I could show you some examples why they are, because you might be able to detect trends. You can attribute abiotic drivers to biotic trends. You can disentangle complexities with relation to land use, to climate change, to land use change, but also the extent and the resolution at which your different processes act on, going back to macrosystems ecology, the interactions with humans, for example, with land management, and from this you can derive management recommendations for land management, but also for conservation. But as I said in the beginning, before you start a call for data, plan your potential workflow, invest time in this. Invest time in developing a proper question or proper hypothesis, using a proper statistical design, and before you start, check the data, and not only the data, but also hopefully well-documented metadata information. Thank you very much.